And with the arrival of Beetlejuice Beetlejuice to the cinemas, another movie being released this year with the job of bringing that old 80s nostalgia back. Because of course the first Beetlejuice is one of the greatest classics of that decade. Personally, one of my favorite movies of that time, and one of my favorites of Tim Burton. And he is a case of a very curious director for me because he brings me mixed feelings. Because on one hand, he is one of the directors that are responsible for making me this movie fanatic that I am today, especially because of the first two Batman movies, mainly the first one for being the first movie I have a memory of my life, my discovery of what a movie is. This because I like even more of the second movie, Batman Returns. These are two great examples of movies that are extremely important for me, but I consider the first decade and a half of Tim Burton's career basically perfect. Starting with a simple one that is Pee-wee's Big Adventure, then going to Beetlejuice, the first two Batman, Nightmare Before Christmas, Ed Wood, Mars Attacks, Sleepy Hollow, and then things start to go south after the remake of Planet of the Apes. After this one, basically none of his movies really appealed to me, with the exception of Corpse Bride that I love from the bottom of my heart. But since then, none of his productions, even though they had his style, his bizarre ideas, none of them could bring back that sensation of the strange and the magical together. And you must have noticed that I skipped one movie from the 90s in his career, because besides being my favorite movie of his, is the movie that has this perfect mix of the strange, the magical, the ugly, and the beautiful. A movie that to me always seemed to be the most personal of Tim Burton, and that came straight from his heart as a storyteller. Edward Scissorhands. Released in 1990, besides being another of his movies that also brings a lot of nostalgia, is a movie that still to this day touches my heart in a personal way every time I watch it. Because besides being completely out of the box, it's very moving. For those who don't remember, the story is about this boy who is created by an inventor that used to live in a castle over a mountain. But before he can finish his creation, he suddenly dies in the castle and leaves Edward with scissor hands, since they were just prototypes of his real hands that would eventually be placed in his arms. And after a long time, the Avon saleswoman Peg Boggs enters the castle to try to sell and finds him there. Sympathizing with the boy right away, she brings him to live in her house that is in the neighborhood around the castle. Then he will be adopted by the Boggs family and fall in love with their older daughter, Kim, played by Winona Ryder, actress that at the time was already known for Tim Burton's movies because of the first Beetlejuice. So in his stay at that house, Edward will have to deal with the norms of real life and live with new creatures called human beings. And what do I love so much about this movie? For starters, this is a creature movie in a way. Yes, Edward is a monster, but never in a bad meaning of the word. And like I said, this is a very personal movie for Tim Burton because as Guillermo del Toro, that is another director that I love, this is a guy that is always focused in showing the point of view of the creature. Just like in the classics of Frankenstein or other old monster movies. If Edward is different, he is misunderstood by the society. And also the story is told as a fairy tale because it is told by the point of view of the old lady from the beginning of the movie, which we will eventually discover it is Winona Ryder's character. And during the movie we also have some punctual flashbacks to show the origins of Edward Scissorhands. And these flashbacks are few, very fast, but very well used as well. Because with few images you start to understand the progression of this character's story, how he was born and why we find him in this situation he is today. And this is another thing that fascinates me in this movie because for being a fairy tale, just like a fairy tale, you don't need to know all the ins and outs of that plot. You buy that reality, you buy the magical elements of that universe. And those magical elements are there, but what is most important is the narrative of the main character. That, as I said, takes us back to the classics of Frankenstein and the Hunchback of Notre Dame, for example. All these stories are about creatures that lived in isolation and then were thrown into the middle of a society that consider itself normal, and they end up suffering their abuses and judgments. And even though this doesn't happen at first because the people of the neighborhood treat Edward as the new big thing, even celebrating his differences and artistic skills, soon things go south and the inevitable confront between the normal and the strange occurs. And besides all these elements that make my eyes already tear up a little, there's another great element in the story, that is the fact that Edward is an artist. And with the beautiful sculptures that he does that are well seen by some and badly seen by others, the movie transmits this idea of how the world is seen through his eyes. And this is great because just like all of us that love to create art, we are all inside our own castles, isolated, creating images to make other people happy, and trying to open a window to our souls based on all the things we have already seen and that we want other people to see through our imagination. This is one of the metaphors in this movie that I think many people can relate, just like me, because Edward is able to create all these images that transform the neighborhoods all around, which is something extremely natural that comes from his soul. But doing all the other activities of the day-to-day routine, he is like a child and pretty incapable of them. And I guess most of us can relate with this idea even though we don't like to admit. And there's the element that Edward Scissorhands was one of the first movies that impacted me very much by its aesthetics. All the idea of the ugly to the eyes of the people that actually is beautiful brings this shock of the dark against the brightness. Edward, with his goth style, is always clashing with everything around him, especially the people with their colorful clothes and the neighborhood houses with their opaque and bland colors. And this is where the design of production shines, because we have this focus on the straight and common lines of the houses against the gothic architecture of the castle and all the things inside it that have great personality and are pretty much alive. And this idea spreads around the neighborhood as we see Edward's impact on it, with his sculptures, the dogs that have their fur trimmed, and the women that have their hairs cut. And this is where it comes the great question for the audience: where is the real beauty? In the bland, in the normal, or in the ugly and different? And this is the main arc of Winona Ryder's character. An arc that is pretty moving because it starts with this feeling of strangeness and fear, gradually transforming into curiosity and fascination until she finally finds true love in him. Love that doesn't come even close to her real boyfriend Jim, played by the actor Anthony Michael Hall, that juiced up since Breakfast Club, since he was the skinny nerd in that movie. And talking about the other characters around Edward, because I love their interactions with him, you have the good side and the bad. In the good side, you have the Boggs family, especially the mother Peg, played by Diane Wiest, which is the mother figure that Edward never had, always treating him with a lot of care and love. Then we have the father Bill, played by the great Alan Arkin, who is the funniest character in the movie for me because his teachings are the teachings of the barbecue dad who just loves to watch his football game on Saturday afternoon with his beer. Especially his teachings about the norms of life to Edward. They're hilarious. And on the bad side, we have all the group of neighbors, especially Joyce, played by Kathy Baker, who is always hunting any man in the movie and end up abusing Edward. That's right, abusing him. Never mind. And then we have the villain of the movie, that is Jim, who involves Edward in a scheme of robbery in his own house, letting all the guilt to the poor guy and making his reputation with all the neighbors go down the toilet seat. And he is so evil that in the end he tries to kill Edward and ends up receiving what he deserves in a spectacular way, in my opinion. But that brings a path with no return to Edward because he can't go back to society after this. Society that, by the way, wanted his head because they were coming towards the castle, just like the peasants with torches from the Frankenstein story. And all this brings the tragic conclusion to Edward's story. And talking about tragic story, we cannot forget about the melancholic soundtrack of Danny Elfman, which is Tim Burton's most recurrent composer of his movies. And here he delivers one of the best soundtracks of cinema for me, because it adds to the whole idea of a fable that this story has. And always brings me to tears in this scene that is the most beautiful of the movie for me, and one of the best in cinema history. I even draw an art about it. And this is Edward Scissorhands. If you didn't realize, this is a love letter to this movie from me, because I love every second of it. I cry every time I watch it. Sometimes it's even difficult to decide to watch it because I know there will be tears. But I cannot forget to mention that all this beautiful story from Tim Burton comes from his collaboration with the writer Caroline Thompson, that also collaborated with him in two other great movies, that is Nightmare Before Christmas and The Corpse Bride. So even though the glories always go to Tim Burton, it's undeniable that it's her sensibility combined with his inventive mind that together were able to create these wonderful stories. Actually, they should have worked many more times together, maybe all of the times. Because every time I think about Tim Burton, it seems to me that his mind works better as the mind of a painter. A guy that goes improvising with his paintbrush until the art comes as genuine as possible. So with his latest movies in the last part of his career, this improvisation came out a little unbalanced. Because even though all of them had their unique Tim Burton-esque style, the narratives came out all flat. And this is where Caroline Thompson and her talent for the fables becomes crucial to create a story that, for me, it crosses the limits of being just a movie and becomes a piece of art that touches our hearts, especially for what it represents. A story about the beautiful and the ugly meeting each other in the midst of all the odds and loving each other for being exactly what they are. And this movie, this tale, this story, this fable will last forever and will always inspire us to be exactly what we are, regardless if the others consider us to be the ugly or the beautiful. And this is it. Thank you so much for being here. If you watched the video so far, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can keep trashing always and always. Alright? See you in the next trashing video, and bye bye.